Help MythVision keep bringing you material by becoming a Patreon member, as well as PayPal. Like, share, subscribe, and comment. Jason, so if you don't mind, your podcast is called Dragons in Genesis. And you do a lot on mythology. You like to look at surrounding cultures, ancient Near Eastern myths, Greco-Roman myths, just a variety of different things, even the Jewish myths and, like Enoch and things later. But I think it'd be important if we go into the topic of common myths that influence the biblical account that we have, the Hebrew Bible, without even getting to the New Testament necessarily.
Yeah.
That gets touched as well. But let's stick with your podcast, Dragons in Genesis. You mentioned in our last show something about dragon carcasses and things. Where did some of these stories come from? And then maybe talk about some of the influence on Genesis, and then we can kind of broad stroke into a variety of different mythologies from various cultures that influence the biblical account.
Yeah, so there was this thing that was incredibly common, incredibly popular in the ancient Near East, and that was this idea of a creation by combat. If you just Google creation by combat myth, you'll see a variety of these things, and they're all very similar. And this is sort of a backdrop for Genesis 1. And the way this works is you have this whole big pantheon of gods. These are polytheistic cultures. And so you have this big pantheon, and in this pantheon, you have this nice little hierarchy, like where you have your creator deity at the top. It's always male, and usually has a consort, and then this whole descending range of deities beneath him. And they're threatened, and they're almost always threatened by the same thing: a water dragon that represents chaos and destruction. And this is essentially the ancient fear of the ocean. You have people who, 99% of them, would never learn to swim in their entire lives. If they go into water that's more than 6 feet deep, they're dead. Even most sailors didn't know how to swim at that time. And so, which that would be a really dangerous job. I mean, you trip and you're dead. So, right? Yeah. And so you have this innate fear of the water, especially because these cultures, they lived on the banks of rivers, they lived near the ocean, and if you have a tidal wave, a tsunami, something like that, which used to be common in the Mediterranean world, because you had volcanic activity out there, like the island of Knossos. So that would be a problem. Heavy rainfall up in the mountains, all of a sudden your river is flooded. And, well, if you live on the river, that means you're probably going to die. And so one flood could wipe out a significant portion of the civilized world in a single day, which actually happened. And we have stories about this. And so water was terrifying. I mean, it was this dark, frightening, powerful, unpredictable force. And so that lived in the minds of people, all the time. And so you have these myths about the water coming up to kill you. And when your city is sponsored by its patron deity, if it gets flooded, well, that probably meant that your deity lost a fight with a water dragon.
Right.
And so you have all these ancient stories about these gods getting into fights with water dragons that represented rivers or the ocean. And so we have this myth, this sort of creation by combat. And what happens is these deities, they're all losing to this water dragon, okay? Or sometimes a host of water dragons. And while they're losing the fight, this one young upstart god, usually a war god, says, hey, I'll make y'all a deal. I'll fight the water dragon. And if I win, I get to sit on the throne of heaven. And the gods are like, sure. What have we got to lose? I mean, we're all about to die. I'd rather this guy rule heaven than for us to all get eaten up by the water dragon. And this is, Yam, Rahab, Tiamat, Leviathan. It's the same thing. And so...
And what are some of the cultures this is coming from? Like, is this coming from the Mesopotamian world? The Sumerian?
Yeah, Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Canaanite, Phoenician.
Okay.
If it's on the Mediterranean
water
if
area.
it's in that region, it has a myth like that. Even some that don't. I mean, we've got myths like this in China and Japan. I mean, look at their dragons.
Right.
All their dragons are like these long serpentine things, and they're usually in the water. Or sometimes they're up in the clouds. Mm-hmm. What comes from the clouds? Water. Rain. You know, they have very similar myths. It's a very similar idea that can come, you know, I mean, you're a primitive people, and one day the water comes up and kills a bunch of your friends. That you personalize this. You know, we did something wrong, or this is there's an intellect behind it. There's a force behind it. Right. That's what myths are. It's often people trying to explain things. You know, where does the lightning come from? Well, there's a magic man in the sky who makes lightning bolts, and he throws them at his enemies. You know, why does the water kill us? Well, it's a monstrous sea dragon that occasionally gets angry and kills us. And so, yeah, we see a lot of them in the Near East. I focus on the ones in the Near East because they are directly related to what I study. But we have these everywhere. If you have a culture that grew up near water, they probably have a flood story. They probably have a water dragon.
And Dr. Price said that Yahweh fought Leviathan. Mm-hmm. And this kind of gives you the implication in Job very clear where he says, have you or can you? And it really reminded me of, remember The Hobbit, where the dragon and they were trying to find the weakness, and he's trying to find the one open scale that was near the heart of that dragon to kill that dragon. Yeah. And finally he finds that one missing piece, and he was able to somehow kill the dragon and defeat it, where the gold and all that was. Well, it reminds me of that, where it's almost like the polemic that God is using towards Job is trying to say, have you, can your spear pierce the armor? Can you, like, he's saying, I did. And it's like, to me, that's kind of embarrassing in modern context, because we would interpret that and go, what a narcissist. Like, it's almost like an older brother telling a younger brother, like, yeah, but are you as powerful as me? Do you feed the birds in the north when they crow for food? And can you feed the lion in the field? And like all this stuff, the rain, the lightning, the snowflake, and then the Leviathan. He's pretty much saying he is. He did. And so, what is Leviathan and Yahweh? Like, is there any backdrop? Is there a book? Is there a story that isn't in our New Testament or in our Old Testament that I'm missing that tells us a little bit more about this Leviathan?
Oh, there's a great deal. there's at least as much outside of the Bible as there is in that's relevant to this. Now, before we move away from The Hobbit, if you read that passage in The Hobbit where Tolkien is describing what the dragon Smaug is like, or where the dragon himself is describing, you know, my claws are like spears, my teeth are harpoons, and my scales are like breastplates, and you know, my wings are hurricanes, and everything else. Go back and read that passage in Job. It's about 15 or 20 lines long, where Yahweh is describing what the Leviathan is like. It's very similar wording and imagery. Now, Tolkien was he was biblically literate. I think whenever he was writing that passage, I think he remembered Job, and he went back and looked at it, and I think that passage where Smaug is describing himself is almost like an homage to this passage in Job. It's very, very similar. I think he was like, I like how this is told. I want to do something similar. Right. And I think it was a nod toward this passage in Job. And read the passage in Job and then read that paragraph in The Hobbit, and you will see what I mean. You can be like, dude, that's totally a nod to the Bible. And I love stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, movies and things.
Yeah, The Hobbit is modern mythology, you know.
Right.
But yeah, so in this creation by combat thing, what normally happens is this young upstart god, Baal Hadad or Marduk. If you read the Enuma Elish, it's centered around Marduk, this Babylonian god. He's the patron of Babylon, the same way that Yahweh is the patron of Jerusalem. And he's going to go and fight the god, the dragon Tiamat. And there's this huge battle, and he eventually wins. And in the victory, he basically dies. I can't remember if he gets swallowed or just mortally wounded, but he basically dies. But then he comes back to life. Many of these gods involved in this creation by combat story are dying and rising gods. They die in the struggle against the darkness, against the chaos, against the destruction, against the water dragon. But then they come back to life. And it's usually their consort or their father who comes in and uses their power to resurrect them. And then they come back to life, and the dragon is then dismembered, and often the body of it is used to create the world. And so in this story, you have like the body of the dragon. It gets cut in half, and this represents the chaotic waters of the primordial world. It then gets divided. And now that half the water is gone, the dry land can emerge. And we see this in Genesis 1. The waters are divided, half of it is put up in the sky, and the rest of it is down on the ground. And now dry land can emerge. Now, the body of the dragon, part of it is used to erect the firmament. This is the big glass dome that covers the snow globe Earth that they believed in. And so it supports the sky ocean, which is the other half of the water. And that's where rain comes from. That's why the sky is blue. And we see this in Genesis 1. First thing he does, he separates the water, into two halves, and half of it is put up above this firmament that is erected to hold up the sky ocean. And so we see the exact same thing happening here. It's just phrased differently. And it goes through all the different steps. They make all the animals and the trees and everything else, and eventually they end up making people. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic with Marduk, it actually happens in pretty much the same order as we see in Genesis 1, beginning with this struggle against the primordial water, which we see in the first verse of Genesis. It talks about the Spirit of God moving over the surface of the abyss. This is the waters. And it concludes with the creation of people, and we see that in the Enuma Elish. But it wasn't just the Babylonians. I mean, everyone had this story.
Right.
The Canaanites had it. It was the god Baal or Baal Hadad. He does the same thing, I believe, with the water dragon Yam. We see the same thing. And as you mentioned in Job, it's a retelling of that, only with their god Yahweh and the Leviathan, which was their version of the creation by combat myth.
Right.
El Elyon sits on the high throne. They're threatened by Leviathan. The young upstart war god Yahweh comes along. He kills Leviathan. And then from its carcass, you get the firmament with the sky ocean. And then they've removed enough water for the dry land to come out.
I think that's funny. I mean, honestly, it's interesting. I mean, if we had no science, right, we had no observation with technology we have today, and we lived in the ancient world, during the day, we would think we're really seeing the sky ocean. It's blue.
Yeah.
And then at night, it would be almost like he, moved the water for us to see into the heavens because you see sparkling stars, and you're like, where'd the water go?
Yeah.
It slowly went away, like God moved the water out of the way for you to see the heavens. So it's really interesting.
And there's this great book that I'm just obsessed with. It's called the Book of Enoch. There's actually like 3 different books of Enoch. I'm really focused on the first one. But in Enoch, there's this whole big section, the centerpiece of the story, called the Astronomy Book. And in it, they explicitly lay out their whole cosmology. And they talk about, like, why the sky is one color during the day and another color at night. Well, they recognize, okay, the sun is going around. That's kind of illuminating the waters above the firmament. Now, why do you see the stars? They didn't believe that the water moved and you can see the stars behind it. No, they believe that the sun and the moon and the stars would come inside the firmament and then fly over the sky. And
because they're beings, right? Or sometimes.
Yeah, they had gates in the firmament. These, because just how you have the floodgates that they mention in Genesis 7, I believe, with Noah's flood. The floodgates opened up and all the water came down and that flooded the earth. They believe that those weren't the only gates. They had gates around the perimeter. And this is where the wind came from, the rain, things like that. They had warehouses outside the firmament. These were the storehouses of heaven. And it had frost, it had rain, it had the dew, it had the winds, everything else. And it also had the stars. And gates would open up in the eastern sky. And angels would bring the stars in and move them over the sky to the western end. And then gates over there would open up and they would take the stars out. And each angel guided a different star. And they had a prescribed course. And that's why the stars move in the same way every single night. If there wasn't an angel guiding them, it would all be chaotic. And they actually have stories about some angels that did the wrong thing with their stars. And it messes everything up. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. But they lay out how the universe works in this one section called the Book of Astronomy, which is overlooked when you study Enoch.
I thought it was fascinating, my recent interview with Dr. Michael Heiser. I actually am quite fascinated with this gentleman. He is a Christian, but he is definitely fringe in terms of like what fundamentalist Christians are willing to even venture. Mm-hmm. And he says blatantly in our interview that the Genesis 6 narrative, the Genesis 3, 6, and 11, there are three chaos situations, if you will, if you'll permit me that, where you have a single character, Satan or serpent. It's not really Satan, it's a serpent that tricks a woman. She ends up falling, death enters the world. You have, in Genesis 6, a corporate, if you will, entities of sons of God, divine beings, as he would put it, and most people I understand will look at this, because there's a lot of overwhelming evidence to use in this argument, rather than saying the nature of the sons of God here are human. Seems more obvious they're divine, in my opinion, but I've heard both sides. And then Genesis 11, where you have to go to Deuteronomy 32 to kind of see more of a worldview, and Psalms, 80-something, 90-something, but where you see that there was this sons of God, Elohim, that were allotted the nations. But he permits this idea, and he says, the Genesis 6 Watchers falling concept with Marduk in the Mesopotamian background, there is this Apkallu character who was venerated in a positive light in their Mesopotamian myth, who came down with divine beings, if you will. They taught humans the culture of life, which you've mentioned on our show before.
Right.
And I will let you elaborate on that. I'm just making the point for anyone who's listening to catch us. And he said that these narratives in the Bible were written as polemics against, because they venerated those characters in the Mesopotamian, but they said the reason that all mankind went evil in the biblical one is because of these very beings.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was fascinating that a Christian was willing to go this far. Now, he argues against polytheism, right? He wants to go, no, there was always Yahweh was the supreme and all that. Okay, I'm not even willing, I'm so glad he even came this far.
Yeah.
He says that on the show, blatantly, that the reason they wrote it was against the idea.
Right.
It's like, well then, what was before? I mean, you're clearly saying that this was written after the fact of these Mesopotamian ones, So,
Right. Yeah, I find stuff like that fascinating, and Michael Heiser he's simply brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, the man is, there's no two ways about it. I mean, it's not an opinion, it's a fact. The man is brilliant, and his analysis of things, especially like the Book of Enoch, and some of these early Christian views are, I think he's onto something.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a Christian. He's going to read it in a certain way.
Right.
But I mean, anytime you're studying anything, you have to be aware that every human being on earth has bias. I mean, anything I read, I'm automatically going to assume that these myths are mythology, and it's just a story written by people trying to explain something. I mean, that's a bias I have. That's how it appears to me.
And sometimes the things they're explaining aren't completely fiction. It's
right.
like the tools and the writing, the way that they wrote things are
Right.
hard to explain. Like the storehouses in heaven opening. Like,
Right.
where are you coming up with this narrative? You know,
Right.
It's their understanding.
Yeah, and I mean, I could be dead wrong. There could be a God up there who's looking down at me like, what an idiot, you
Right.
know? I mean, that's how my bias works. So you have to be aware of any kind of bias, you know.
Well, you're
and
not
just
convinced
watch
there
out.
is one. That's the thing.
Right.
So
Yeah, there could be. That'd give me more material for my podcast, you know. But yeah, so, I mean, anytime you're reading anything by anyone, be aware that everyone has, you know, a bias in one direction or another. We have multiple biases going all the time. But that certainly doesn't detract from the man's work. He is brilliant, and I think he has a vastly superior understanding of Enoch when compared to most biblical scholars who are not religious, because most of them see it as just this bizarre apocalyptic work that doesn't really have much of a relation to Judaism or Christianity. It's just this thing that they kind of see, and they're like, okay, it was there at the time, but I don't really know what to do with it, and they just shove it aside. And I think that's a mistake.
Heiser actually believes, and that's what makes this valuable, is that the motivation and drive for him is he really believes these words, he believes these guys, this account called the Bible. As a Christian, I know from experience that he presses on to try and see if these are true. I mean, look, he could do like most Christians, discredit it, be on, focus on the canon, 66 books, let's go with it. Try and brush past Jude and 2 Peter, find ways to skip those portions. Well, you misunderstand, or try to humanize these things in some way. He doesn't. He really wants to. And I think him having that worldview as held sacred for him helps drive him into trying to investigate further deep into those things, which I think, are seeing something he's not, and that's okay. But I am very thankful that he has that worldview to press deep for us to see, you know what? He's put a lot of pieces together. He made the case in his book Demons, I suspect in his, what is it, the realm?
The Unseen Realm.
Unseen Realm. He makes a good case in Second Temple literature and the biblical literature that they're using this Sons of God narrative into not only the biblical narrative, but also outside of it. And so,
right. And I think it's important to look at the work that comes from believers, because as a person who holds these worldviews, who is living inside of this literature, they're going to see things and understand things about the literature that is very different from how you and I would see it and understand it.
Right.
And this gets us closer, perhaps. This gets us closer to the understanding of the people who wrote it.
It can.
It can. I mean, they
careful,
will be
because
reading
even
their own modern religion will definitely color their understanding of it. And that's one of the things, that's a bias you need to be aware of. But, some of them, like Heiser, like Margaret Barker, have taken it, I believe, closer to first century Christianity than most secular scholars have.
I agree with you, and I love that you said that. I apologize for interrupting you. When I just was trying to point out, like, quickly, fundamentalist in the sense of like modern Protestant movements and such. They even Dr. Heiser on my show, which you will see. It hasn't been released yet. That tells you when I'm recording this, by the way. If you have the wisdom, thou shalt know. Calculate the number of days. No,
Enoch told me about the Heiser episode before he even came here.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Told him not to tell you.
He writes everything down, and I get a copy. I'm sorry, man.
It's all good.
I probably shouldn't have said that.
No. He even says, he's like, this Calvinism, like all of the isms and the schisms, he's like, they're just, they can't see. They can't go there. And they've kind of painted their own walls up, in imaginary walls, to prevent themselves from even going there. So with the chaos dragons and the creation warfare, is there any last thing you'd like to say on that?
Um, I think if you familiarize yourself with these ancient Near Eastern myths, there's a book just about Canaanite mythology that you can get. Just look for Canaanite myths on Amazon, and you can find a copy of like the Ugaritic text, which is fascinating reading. It tells all about like the Baal cycle and things like that. You familiarize yourself with this, with the Enuma Elish, things like that. Then, whenever you begin reading something like Genesis 1 or the story of Job or anything like that, you can really see that this wasn't like this weird standalone mythology. This was something that actually fit well within the contemporary thinking. This was a common understanding of the universe, and it's you find that the Old Testament actually fits quite nicely within Near Eastern mythology.